Hi, this is John Hanson, and this is another in a series of flipped classroom videos designed to give more time in the classroom for student questions and discussion. This video is to be used only by students in my class and only for pedagogical and learning purposes. Its contents may not be shared, copied, recorded, or reproduced by any means or for any purpose. This video looks at the blame frame crisis in the first half of the 20th century, how that crisis and changing perceptions of inequality, power, and legitimacy led many to perceive injustice, and how that connected to a trend in art, journalism, and law to more realistically examine inequalities and their causes, and finally how all of that shaped law and policy during FDR's New Deal. Continuing with our situationist history, looking back to the late 19th and early 20th century, it's clear that the inequalities were growing and becoming increasingly stark, as was the dissonance that many felt as a consequence. In 1888, Grover Cleveland included the following in his State of the Union address. The gulf between employers and the employed is constantly widening, and classes are rapidly forming, one comprising the very rich and powerful, while in another are found the toiling poor. Corporations, which should be the carefully restrained creatures of the law and the servants of the people, are fast becoming the people's masters. Whatever headway progressives might have been making in response to those sorts of concerns came to a temporary halt by 1917, during World War I and the violent upheaval and political turbulence that would follow the Great War. The momentum of the progressive era was lost. The economy would boom, unemployment would all but disappear, and wages would increase. All of that would increase the expectation and demands of labor, and in 1919, 4 million workers would walk off the job in roughly 3,600 strikes and work stoppages. Confronted by that labor challenge, big business, with support of local, state, and national governments, would push back. Business not only found ways to break strikes directly, it helped to initiate and promote a Red Scare and employed those fears to regain dominant power over workers and the government, at least for a while. The story is too much to review here. It's enough to say that many historians argue that this time period represents the end of the progressive era and a return to laissez-faire policies. Still, a decade or so later, in 1929, the dynamics of power would change yet again, and the progressive era ideas would soon permeate the philosophy and policies of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, or FDR, who was first elected president in 1932. During that decade, income inequalities again intensified further, and an injustice dissonance reflecting growing sense that the inequalities were being produced by the institutions associated with capitalism, including large banks, sprawling corporations, and hegemonic trusts. The problem came to a head following the stock market crash in 1929 and Great Depression, which were widely interpreted as proof that capitalism was good for a few but bad for most, and that corporations themselves were just too powerful, like invading beasts, pursuing profit without regard to the consequences. The power and wealth and inequality were increasingly perceived as an illegitimate product of corrupt and selfish actors. This chart captures in monetary terms the trends identified with the Great Depression, both in terms of income inequality, the orange line representing the share of income going to the top 10%, and the blue line representing the share of wealth enjoyed by the wealthiest top 10%. When the stock market crashed in 1929, income and wealth inequality were both near all-time highs in this country. This chart captures the extent of the stock market crash itself. Over the course of a month or so, the Dow Jones Industrial Average plummeted from a value of nearly 400 to something around half of that. The economic depression that the crash precipitated extended through North America, Europe, and other industrialized areas of the world. It lasted until about 1939 and was the strongest and most severe depression ever experienced by the industrialized Western world. In 1929, the unemployment rate was close to 3%. In 1933, at the worst point in the Great Depression, unemployment rates in the U.S. reached almost 25%, with more than 11 million people looking for work. Among the unemployed were farmers who had lost their land and homes to foreclosure as a result of the Dust Bowl. So-called Hoovervilles and shantytowns sprung up across America as people congregated where they could and where there might be jobs, and constructed makeshift homes out of packing crates, abandoned vehicles, and scraps of wood. As a result of those influences, the inequality legitimating and power legitimating ideologies, including social Darwinism, eugenics, and laissez-faire economics, all of which were built upon a broader nature frame, were under severe strain. As the legitimating frames were losing credibility in light of the worsening inequalities, changing power dynamics, and lived experience of many in the 20th century, the contrast between who we are and who we claim to be was becoming visible. And without any legitimating frames, those inequalities were harder to deny and easier to characterize as symptoms of injustice, giving way to what might be called a blame frame crisis. Without legitimating narratives to fall back upon, many people were more inclined to look carefully at those inequalities with compassion and at the system with skepticism. In part for that reason, the culture experienced a trend toward realism, a heightened willingness to begin examining ourselves as we actually were and to confront some of the evident injustices. At the same time, of course, there were also desires to limit the scope of the problem and to come up with news stories, authorities, or ideologies that might help to legitimate our system. The underlying realism expressed itself, for instance, in art, literature, and photography, designed to highlight, not obscure, the suffering of the poor and marginalized. Jacob Riis, a Danish-American social reformer, a muckraking journalist, and a photographer, became a household name, capturing through his camera lens life in the slums of New York during the late 19th and early 20th century. Riis himself had experienced poverty, and he hoped to help alleviate the bad living conditions of poor people by exposing them to the middle and upper classes. Walker Evans was one of numerous photographers hired by the Farm Security Administration in the 1930s to photograph under FDR's administration. As the following photos illustrate, Evans' photos depicted the desperate need of the poor with simplicity and clarity. No photographer better illustrates that trend toward realism than does Dorothea Lange, an influential American photographer and photojournalist best known for her Depression-era pictures that humanized the victims of the Great Depression and advanced the development of documentary photography. Dorothea traveled around the U.S. by car, which often doubled as the platform from which she took many of her famous photos. She understood herself as attempting through images to promote a collective self-examination. She put it this way: the subject of poverty has to be unearthed and looked at again. No country has ever closely scrutinized itself visually that I know of. I know what we could make of it if people only thought we could dare look at ourselves. Here's a sample of her remarkable photos. Dorothea's most iconic image was taken in a pea pickers camp where conditions were bleak. 2 weeks of sleet and steady rain had destroyed the pea crop. There was no work and no money to buy food. Dorothea was drawn to one particular place. She gave this account of the experience. I saw and approached the hungry and desperate mother as if drawn by a magnet. I do not remember how I explained my presence or my camera to her, but I do remember she asked me no questions. I made 5 exposures, working closer and closer from the same direction. I did not ask her name or her history. She told me her age, that she was 32. She said that they had been living on frozen vegetables from the surrounding fields and birds that the children killed. There she sat in that lean-to, with her children huddled around her, and seemed to know that my pictures might help her. And so she helped me. There was a sort of equality about it. Dorothea then climbed back in her car and drove home, where she quickly developed the negatives and rushed several photographs to the San Francisco News. This photo, titled Migrant Mother, would become one of the most famous photographs in U.S. history. In the short term, it would help motivate the federal government to send 20,000 pounds of food to the roughly 3,000 starving migrants in that pea camp. Many of the same themes would be echoed and confirmed by journalists and authors who, like the photographers, were looking closely and empathetically at how the poor and impoverished were living or working. Corporate power, its influence over government, and its dominance over workers was increasingly viewed as the crux of the problem. The increasing size, wealth, and power of corporations, coupled with their newfound ability to produce on mass scale, presented corporate leaders with new opportunities, to be sure, but also with a major challenge. The firms and industries needed to create and maintain some degree of credibility and trust with the American citizenry, or lose their legitimacy and be regulated heavily. As cutthroat competition in the tumultuous marketplace led to a concentration of wealth and power among a small number of business leaders, journalists, so-called muckrakers, wrote detailed exposés about the corrupt and sometimes horrifying practices that were behind those fortunes. Authors like Lincoln Steffens, Ida Tarbell, and Upton Sinclair became household names as they tried to make plain the suffering of the have-nots and the seeming heartlessness of large corporate trusts. In several senses of the word then, big business had a trust problem. This problem was particularly acute following the Great Depression, which confirmed growing fears that capitalism was good for a few but bad for most, and that corporations themselves were heartless and soulless money-making machines. A realism-based approach also found its way into legal theory and law. Legal realism is generally associated with the culmination of the early 20th century attack on the orthodox claims of late 19th century formalism or classical legal thought in the U.S., and linked to the progressivism that would animate FDR's New Deal. Legal realism substituted relatively situationist attributional presumptions for the relatively dispositionist assumptions of formalism. To understand legal realism, it may be helpful to understand the approach it sought to replace. Formalists believed that the law constituted a set of clear formal rules from which judges could reach decisions in individual cases by applying the rules almost mechanically to the facts. Christopher Columbus Langdell, who put Harvard Law School on the map, believed that law was a science. In his words, all the available materials of that science are contained in printed books. The library is to us all that the laboratories of the university are to the chemists and physicists. The Museum of Natural History is to the zoologist. The botanical garden is to the botanist. From Langdell's basic proposition that law is a science, several subsidiary propositions seem to follow. First, Legal truth is a species of scientific truth. In other words, one can understand it first by identifying the relevant categories that emerge as if from nature, or in this case, from legal doctrine. Second, to identify a legal truth is to discover something that is immutable and durable. Third, there are a finite number of fundamental legal principles that, once identified, can be applied scientifically, objectively, and perspectivelessly to a case to determine the appropriate outcome. There is no room for morality or politics or personal preference. Phoebe Ellsworth describes, quote, the essence of legal formalism as the idea that a few basic top-level categories and principles formed a conceptually ordered system above a large number of bottom-level rules. The rules themselves were ideally the holdings of established precedents, which upon analysis could be seen to be discovered from the principles. In other words, there is a pyramid of rules with a few fundamental first principles at the top, from which mid-level and finally a large number of specific rules could be derived. The legal decision maker, faced with a case to be decided, would look to the body of law and discover the rule that determined the correct result. At Harvard Law School, students learned about the law from the law itself, in search of those abstract categories and principles within existing cases. As the young men would discover through their Socratic exchanges led by older men, a judge's decisions were based not on historical, political, or social context, but rather exclusively on the pertinent legal precedents, doctrinal principles, and careful legal reasoning. Legal rules were presumed good, as were the social practices and outcomes that those rules reflected and reinforced. Among those clear, appropriate, and desirable practices were, for instance, the contrasting roles for men and women, and for individuals from different races and classes. That is, customary answers regarding who does what and who gets what were seen as correct and in sync with nature and nature's laws. Legal scholar Martha Chamalas and historian Nancy Kerber described the dualistic understanding of men and women that was long reflected in the law as follows. The history of women has been confined by dualisms, home versus market, household versus state, as the history of the relationship between men and women, public versus private, culture versus nature, defender versus protected. These dualisms have traditionally been expressed in the language of separate spheres, a series of metaphors that impose a dichotomy on understandings of relationships and interactions. Men and women have been enmeshed in a system of meaning and law, discounted and failed to recognize the claims associated with women and their interests. It's easy to see how such formalist categories, axioms, and presumptions would lead to a series of hierarchy-enhancing rules and practices, all of which would be self-reinforcing and self-fulfilling. This self-fulfilling cycle of theory, practice, ideology, and experience helped to maintain the dualisms that simultaneously insulated them from critique. That formalistic system of hierarchy perpetuation may help explain the starkly contrasting attitudes described earlier this semester held by the faculty at Harvard Law School as compared to that held by the faculty at Yale Law School regarding the admission and inclusion of women as students or faculty. After all, not all law schools were so committed to Langdellian notions. While Harvard gained dominance by embracing the conservative ideology of legal formalism, Yale edged the other way. One history explains that Harvard's was a dogmatic tradition that inspired Yale's anti-dogmatism, a disciplinary isolation that inspired Yale's interdisciplinary experiment. Where legal formalism treated the categories of law as obvious and distinct, legal realism saw nuance and overlap. Where formalists saw black and white, realists saw gray. Instead of reifying the principles and categories of law, legal realism focused on exposing the malleability of those principles and the arbitrariness of the formalist categorical thresholds and boundaries. Phoebe Ellsworth describes the failures of formalism this way. As time goes by and the legal landscape becomes dense with more and more intermediate cases, the failures of formalism become increasingly apparent. Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. summarized the challenge to formalism in these words. Two widely different cases suggest a general distinction which is a clear one when stated broadly. But as new cases cluster around the opposite poles and begin to approach each other, the distinction becomes more difficult to trace. The determinations are made one way or the other on a very slight preponderance of feeling rather than articulate reason. And at last, a mathematical line is arrived at by the contact of contrary decisions, which is so far arbitrary that it might equally well have been drawn a little further to one side or the other. From that vantage point, much of law was seen as either arbitrary or worse, designed and constructed by man, not nature. Such laws could therefore be redesigned, and any hierarchy enforcing effects of formalism seemed more and more like an unmerited reward to be enjoyed by the law's beneficiaries. Viewed through such a lens, the growing inequalities of the late 19th and early 20th centuries came to feel very different. Legal realists were witnessing power where it had been hidden before. They began to see many elements of the legal system as lacking legitimacy. Where formalists presumed justice, the realists detected injustice. Legal scholar Stephen Alton summarizes legal realism in these words. The legal realists were skeptical of the old formalists, Langdellian order. Law, an exact science? Nonsense, they scoffed. The law was not a value-free system of objective black-letter rules. Legal rules and the decisions made by the courts when applying those rules were hardly neutral. In the opinion of the realists, the formalists of the Langdellian era had used the law to bolster the laissez-faire economic system, yet this was despite the formalists' claim that they merely were applying timeless legal principles that had been scientifically discovered. Legal realists, in other words, were not content to maintain or justify the status quo simply because it is the law. Legal realists instead looked for mechanisms within the legal structure that might have contributed to the subjugation of disadvantaged groups, and they endeavored to remedy them. The institutions that legal realists found most troubling, as too powerful, as a threat to democracy, and as capable of bending the law toward their own ends, were corporations, non-human entities capable of overpowering their creators. Their concerns included the possibility that banks and massive corporations would threaten the very governments that created them as well as the various stakeholders that interacted with them, and that the power was hidden and enhanced by the illusion of free markets and consensual contracts. Consider the writings of Robert Lee Hale, an American lawyer and economist who earned an economics degree at Harvard University and then taught at Columbia Law School. He was among the group of scholars known as legal realists, and his work focused particularly on the distributive impact of legal rules. He captured the situation of powerless and desperate workers negotiating with monopolistic employers by analogizing the power born of distribution to coercive power. If an individual works, he wrote, in order to avoid the withholding of income, is he not doing so as the lesser of two evils? And is not the acceptance of the lesser of two evils the essence of coercion? That he welcomes the opportunity signifies only that he prefers to have a choice between the two evils rather than be compelled to accept the greater one. It does not prove that the acceptance of the lesser evil is voluntary. He accepts the lesser evil gladly only because he takes for granted the alternative of the greater evil. Hale's observation was an insight, perhaps to legal scholars, but it was obvious to many workers who suffered through the exploitative contracts in the name of freedom of contract. Hale further emphasized that the freedoms celebrated by defenders of free market ideology were an illusion that eclipsed subtle but potentially significant sources of coercion. As he put it, the systems advocated by professed upholders of laissez-faire are in reality permeated with coercive restrictions of individual freedom. Some sort of coercive restriction of individuals is absolutely unavoidable. Similarly, he characterized property rights and deference to contract as a means of reproducing or enhancing the fortunes of the haves and extracting more from the have-nots. The market value of a property, he wrote, or of a service is merely a measure of the strength of the bargaining power of the person who owns the one or renders the other, under the particular legal rights with which the law endows him, and the legal restrictions which it places on others. From that perspective, existing legal rights are not distributionally neutral. In fact, they are distributional drivers. Law might appear to be natural, but, according to Hale, laws are not natural in the least. They are created by and often for those with the power to create them, interpret them, enforce them, know them, and manipulate them. Laws are part of that designed situation, and by design they can be constructed to shield some and to flood others. Morris Cohen was another prominent legal realist who questioned the characterization of the market as a purely voluntary institution. Cohen's influential article, Property and Sovereignty, likened the power associated with property holdings to state sovereignty. Focusing heavily on the inequalities of bargaining power, he flipped the traditional argument that government regulation is coercive and argued that such regulation can be empowering by limiting other sources of coercion. Cohen employed a situationist conception of the worker and therefore of choice, freedom, and law. He wrote, "The character of property as sovereign power compelling service and obedience may be obscured for us in a commercial economy by the fiction of the so-called labor contract as a free bargain and by the frequency with which service is rendered indirectly through a money payment. But not only is there actually little freedom to bargain on the part of the steel worker or miner who needs a job, but in some cases the medieval subject had as much power to bargain when he accepted the sovereignty of his lord. The greater economic power of the employer exercises a compulsion as real in fact as any recognized by law as duress. The extreme form of such duress, the highwayman's pistol, still leaves us the freedom to accept the terms offered or else take the consequences. But such choice is surely the very opposite of what men value as freedom." Cohen's point is that if one focuses on only the two individuals in a contract, at the moment that they enter the contract, it's easy to miss the situation of which the law is a part. But that situation can be every bit as coercive as the gun that the law sees and renders the agreement non-consensual. Similarly, Cohen emphasized that just as it may sometimes be wise to be on guard against the power of a sovereign state, it may also be wise to be suspicious of the power of the propertied sovereign, such as large corporations and banks. Humanity has been ruled by priests, soldiers, hereditary landlords, and even antiquarian scholars. The results are not such as to make us view with alarm a new type of ruler. But if we are entering a new era involving a new set of rulers, it is well to recognize it and reflect on what is involved. Many factors contributed to the rise of a new hegemon to compete with and to capture the state. One of them is the fundamental attribution error, the dispositionist causal attributions that helped camouflage more situational forces and located responsibility and blame on the victims of coercive situational power. Using different terminology, Morris Cohen cautions that dispositionist attributions may interfere with, rather than promote, freedom. The principle of freedom of personality certainly cannot justify a legal order wherein a few can, he wrote, by virtue of their legal monopoly over necessities, compel others to work under the degrading and brutalizing conditions. A government which limits the right of large landholders limits the rights of property, and yet may promote real freedom. He goes on. There must be restrictions on the use of property, not only in the interest of other property owners, but also in the interest of the health, safety, religion, morals, and general welfare of the whole community. No community can view with indifference the exploitation of the needy by commercial greed. Cohen's arguments had relevance not just for the relationship between a corporation and its workers, but also for that between sellers and consumers. For instance, Cohen wrote, "For the first time in the history of mankind, the producer of things is in the saddle. Not, of course, the actual producer, but the mastermind that directs the currents of production." As this engram suggests, at the time Cohen was writing, these new industries, advertisers, marketers, and public relations, were taking root. One strategy that seemed to be having a lot of success during that time might be termed shame selling, creating standards and ideals that consumers would find it difficult to meet except through the purchase of a given product, but which not meeting would become a source of shame. Hygiene products and body and beauty standards would become very popular in this time period through that process. Here's a few typical examples. This ad blamed a woman's job loss on her gray hair, which she could have avoided. This poor woman won't leave her room because of the shame of acne. This one is mortified by her dishpan hands, the consequence presumably of doing all the dishes. The woman depicted in this ad seems to have it all. She was perfect wife, lovely, efficient, economical, affectionate, cheerful, but she was careless about feminine hygiene. And the ad continues. Her husband would gladly have traded most of her virtues to correct this one fault. This ad and this woman suffers from marital turmoil that comes from failing to meet her husband's standards of whiteness. Here's another woman who seems to meet the beauty standards but wastes all the benefits by choosing the wrong deodorant. She may be pleasing to the eye, but not to the nose. What a shame. This woman makes shameful the inevitable flaws of age. There were some, but fewer ads that were directed at men. Here's one that typifies the bodybuilding ads made famous by Charles Atlas, who promised to turn a body of shame into one of fame. Such ads may have been in part what Morris Cohen was referring to when he wrote, "Those who have the power to standardize and advertise certain products do determine what we may buy and use." In a way, legal realists were arguing that our systems, including our legal and political systems, and the minds of consumers, were captured by the interests of large commercial entities, or non-human corporations. So when they argue that legal formalism is really just a means of justifying laissez-faire and the distributional inequalities it generates, they are implicating the law as part of the problem. Criticisms of the corporation, the problem of capture, and the call for greater restrictions on corporate power would continue well into the 1960s. But I'm getting ahead of the story. For now, I want to focus on FDR's New Deal, which reflected a resurgence of the state against the corporation. A sample of clips from FDR's 1936 State of the Union address illustrates that connection.
For out of this modern civilization, economic royalists carved new dynasties. New kingdoms were built upon concentration of control over material things. through new uses of corporations and banks and securities, new machinery of industry and agriculture, of labor and capital, all undreamed of by the fathers, the whole structure of modern life was impressed into this royal service. And so it was natural and perfectly human that the privileged princes of these new economic dynasties, thirsting for power, reached out for control over government itself. They created a new despotism and wrapped it in the robes of legal sanction. In its service, new mercenaries sought to regiment the people, their labor, their property, and as a result, the average man once more confronts the problem that faced the Minuteman of '76.
FDR continued, a small group had concentrated into their own hands an almost complete control over other people's property, other people's money, other people's labor, other people's lives. For too many of us, life was no longer free, liberty no longer real. Men could no longer follow the pursuit of happiness. The hours men and women worked, the wages they received, the conditions of their labor, these had passed beyond the control of the people and were imposed by this new industrial dictatorship. For too many of us, the political equality we once had won was meaningless in the face of economic inequality.
Against economic tyranny such as this, the American citizen could only appeal to the organized power of government. We well remember that the collapse of 1929 showed up the despotism for what it was. And the election of 1932 was the people's mandate to end it, and under that mandate, it is being ended.
These economic royalists complain that we seek to overthrow the institutions of America. What they really complain of is that we seek to take away their power. Our allegiance to American institutions requires the overthrow of this kind of power. In vain they seek to hide behind the flag and the Constitution. In their blindness they forget what the flag and the Constitution stand for. Now, as always, they stand for democracy, not tyranny, for freedom, not subjection, and against a dictatorship by mob rule and the overprivileged alike. As that speech illustrates, the ideas of legal realism would animate New Deal policies. But those ideas and conceptions were influencing all the law at that time, and many in the judiciary were likewise coming to accept a similar set of attitudes about the forces shaping law and about the possibility of law being used in ways that would promote justice and freedom by, among other methods, curtailing the power of large corporations and shifting the law to favor the interests of consumers over producers, workers over employers, patients over doctors, and so on. The changes in law, including expansions of tort law that would take place in the early 20th century, were part of this larger movement, which itself was in response to the growing inequalities and increased sensitivity to sources of power and coercion. A belief that to the growing power of the corporation, there was only one institution capable of pushing back and protecting the freedom of American citizens, and that was the American government itself. This flipped classroom video has examined the blame frame crisis prior to World War II, how that crisis and changing perceptions of inequality, power, and legitimacy led many to perceive injustice where they hadn't before. How that connected to a trend toward realism in art, journalism, and law, and how all of that shaped law and policy during FDR's New Deal.